May 7, 1942, 22:14 p.m., deep in the humid darkness of the Solomon Sea, as the moon hid behind drifting clouds and the horizon dissolved into a black void where ocean and sky became indistinguishable, the Japanese destroyer Kuroshio sliced through the waves like a phantom, its hull whispering against the water as though the sea itself feared to obstruct its path, and inside its bridge, illuminated by faint red lamps that preserved night vision, Captain Hiroshi Tokimura watched the radarless horizon with the calm confidence of a man who understood he commanded one of the deadliest ships ever built. The Kagerō-class destroyers were not ordinary escorts. They were predators engineered for speed, stealth, and devastating torpedo warfare, carrying the weapon that terrified American sailors unlike anything else in the Pacific, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a 24-inch oxygen-fueled Titan capable of reaching incredible ranges with ferocious explosive power, and unlike Allied torpedoes, it left almost no visible wake, making its approach nearly undetectable until the moment it struck, detonating with a fury that could rip a cruiser open like paper. As the Kuroshio sped through the black water, the crew moved in disciplined silence, their rubber-soled shoes absorbing sound, their voices low and controlled, trained to fight under the cloak of night where Japanese naval doctrine surpassed anything the Americans possessed at the time. For years Japan had practiced nocturnal surface attacks, honing their crews in complex maneuvers, synchronized torpedo spreads, and coordinated destroyer wolf pack tactics that turned night combat into an art form. Across the ocean to the east, American radar operators struggled to understand how entire Japanese divisions could appear and vanish like phantoms, how their torpedoes could strike from impossible distances, how U.S. cruisers could explode before ever seeing their attackers, and the frustration of facing an invisible enemy became a weight on the minds of thousands of sailors who knew the legend. If you see the destroyer that launched the Long Lance, then it wasn't aimed at you. On this night, however, an American task force was unknowingly drifting into danger, its destroyers spaced too widely, its radar still primitive, its doctrine still evolving, and its commanders unaware that Japan's elite night fighting ships were already closing in. The Kuroshio and its sister ships, Kagerō, Oyashio, Maikaze, moved in a tight formation, engines throttled low to reduce their acoustic signature, their crews listening to the sea with hydrophones, tracking distant propeller beats that revealed the presence of unsuspecting prey. Captain Tokimura ordered his helmsman to adjust course by 2 degrees, aligning the ship with the anticipated path of the American column, and in the torpedo room, sailors prepared the Type 93s with meticulous care, sliding their massive forms into launch tubes, checking valves, securing warheads, and whispering brief prayers, for even the men who fired them respected their destructive power. Meanwhile, aboard the American cruiser USS Chicago, fatigue clung to the night watch like a wet blanket. Radar screens flickered with static, operators struggled to distinguish real echoes from atmospheric clutter, and lookouts strained their eyes over the inky sea, unaware that a formation of Japanese destroyers was already less than 10 miles away, hidden by darkness and disciplined silence. The Japanese had mastered the art of approaching under the faint noise of distant surf and wind, letting nature mask their engines, and their torpedo doctrine, built on speed, surprise, and overwhelming spreads, allowed them to unleash dozens of long lances in minutes, creating walls of death across the water that no ship could outrun. As the gap tightened, Tokimura raised his binoculars, though he already knew visibility was nearly zero. He wasn't looking for silhouettes, but flashes, gun muzzles, deck lights, glimmers of reflection, anything that betrayed human presence. His instincts, sharpened by years of training under Admiral Reizo Tanaka, the master of Japanese night tactics, told him the moment had come. He gave the order, "Prepare to launch." The crew responded instantly, rotating the torpedo mounts into firing position, calculating bearings, adjusting gyro angles. Each spread was designed to saturate a predicted area, not chase a single target, and this doctrine often resulted in multiple American ships taking hits from a single attack. Minutes later, as the Americans continued their slow, unaware march through the darkness, the Kuroshio began its deadly maneuver, turning broadside to the enemy, an exposed position to most navies but a necessary one for the full launch of long lances, and in the torpedo room, the men steadied themselves as Tokimura whispered the command that echoed through the dim corridors of the ship like a death sentence delivered to the night. Fire! With a deep metallic roar masked by the ocean's emptiness, the long lances shot from their tubes, vanishing into the black water with almost no surface turbulence, each one a silent serpent racing across the sea at extraordinary speeds, guided by oxygen propulsion that produced no telltale bubbles. As Tokemura turned his ship sharply to evade any potential counterattack, the torpedoes sped toward the American task force, still undetected, still silent, still invisible. Aboard the USS Chicago, a sonar operator frowned as faint mechanical pulses whispered across his headphones. Too faint, he thought, probably biological echoes or reflected waves. He reported uncertainty, and the officer on duty, exhausted and irritable, dismissed it as ocean noise. 30 seconds later, the first long lance struck. The explosion tore through the night like a thunderstorm erupting underwater, lighting the sea in a flash of blinding white. Aboard the Chicago, men were thrown from their feet, alarms blared, compartments filled with smoke, and sailors scrambled to damage control stations as shock waves ripped through the hull. Before they could recover, a second torpedo slammed into another ship in the formation, and panic spread as crews realized they had no visual on the attackers. There was nothing to shoot at, nothing to chase, nothing to identify. In the chaos, the Americans turned on their searchlights, a fatal mistake that silhouetted their ships against the darkness and revealed their exact positions to the Japanese destroyers waiting patiently at range. From miles away, Tokemura watched the glow with satisfaction. The Americans had lit themselves up like targets in a firing range, unaware that Japanese gunners were already adjusting their ranges and preparing salvos. The next minutes descended into chaos, the Americans firing wildly into the night, Japanese destroyers unleashing volleys with practiced precision, torpedoes carving deadly arcs across the sea, and the Kuroshio weaving through darkness untouched, a phantom amid fire. It was battles like this that built the legend of the Kagerō-class, ships so fast, so deadly, and so invisible that American sailors believed they were fighting ghosts. And yet, this dominance would not last forever. While Japan still ruled the night, the seeds of their downfall had already been planted. In American radar laboratories, in improved destroyer tactics, in faster escort ships, and in doctrines that learned painfully from every torpedo hit. But on this night, in May of 1942, the ocean still belonged to the ghost destroyers of Japan, and the Long Lance remained the undefeated king of the Pacific. May 8, 1942, 1:27 a.m., as burning oil spread across the black surface of the Solomon Sea and smoke rose in twisting pillars that blurred into the night, the Japanese destroyer Kuroshio slowed its engines to near silence, gliding through a battlefield littered with debris and distant cries, for although the Americans had fired back with desperation, their shots drifted harmlessly across empty water, chasing phantoms that had already repositioned miles away, and Captain Hiroshi Tokemura stood on the bridge with his binoculars lifted, scanning the faint orange glow of crippled U.S. cruisers struggling to contain fires that spread like hungry beasts devouring steel. The Long Lance torpedoes had done their work with merciless efficiency, and the Japanese destroyer formation, leaders in the Imperial Navy's doctrine of nocturnal annihilation, was already preparing for a second attack run, recalculating distances, adjusting gyro angles, and planning another wave of torpedoes meant to finish off the American task force before dawn revealed their position. For Tokemura knew that sunrise was the enemy of Japanese night tactics, that American aircraft would soon arrive, and that to linger too long was to invite death from above. Yet he also understood something deeper. These night battles were not merely tactical victories. They were psychological battles that left American sailors terrified of shadows, convinced that death lurked in every wave. Reports from survivors of previous engagements spoke of invisible torpedoes ripping ships apart without warning, of destroyers appearing and disappearing like spirits, and of a cunning enemy who exploited the night as though they had been born in darkness. Meanwhile, aboard the battered USS Chicago, the chaos that followed the torpedo strikes was beyond comprehension. Sailors stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, water surged through ruptured compartments, and damage control crews fought to keep the ship afloat as flames consumed everything in their path, while above deck, the captain stared into the night with rage and disbelief, shouting orders to fire star shells that illuminated vast sections of empty ocean where the Japanese destroyers had been minutes earlier, but were now long gone. The American sailors felt as though they were fighting ghosts, enemy ships moving with impossible precision, striking without being seen, their torpedoes arriving like silent messengers of death. And deep inside the Chicago's engineering spaces, men worked with trembling hands to stabilize the boilers, their hearts pounding as they prayed the ship wouldn't split apart beneath them. Back aboard the Kuroshio, Tokemura received a report from hydrophone operators. New propeller signatures detected to the southwest, indicating a second U.S. group attempting to reinforce the damaged ships. The news brought a cold determination to his face. This was not just a skirmish. It was an opportunity to cripple American naval presence in the area and demonstrate once more the supremacy of Japanese night doctrine. He ordered a course adjustment, shifting the destroyer formation into an intercept pattern designed to strike the reinforcements before they could assist their wounded allies, and in the torpedo room, crews hastily reloaded tubes with fresh long lances, sweat dripping down their faces despite the cool night air, for each torpedo weighed more than a small car and required coordinated manpower to position safely. As the Japanese force closed in again, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of American distress signals, frantic Morse flashes from crippled ships begging for help. These signals served as beacons for the approaching U.S. destroyers, but they also revealed their approximate position to the waiting Japanese hunters. The first silhouettes appeared minutes later, dark shapes against the faint backdrop of burning wreckage, and Tokemura recognized the outlines of U.S. destroyers charging in at high speed, guns already trained forward, unaware that they were rushing directly into a carefully laid trap. The Americans fired illumination rounds that burst into brilliant suns overhead, turning darkness into blinding daylight for a few seconds, but this only highlighted their own positions, revealing the sharp lines of their hulls as easy targets. Tokemura saw his opening. He ordered another torpedo spread, this time angled to intersect the predicted path of the American reinforcements, and again the long lances slid silently into the sea, racing forward like invisible predators unleashed into the depths. Meanwhile, the American destroyers, relying heavily on their radar, believed they had the advantage. New radar systems gave them confidence that they could detect Japanese ships before visual contact, but what they didn't know was that radar could only reveal position, not intention, not doctrine, not the lethal geometry of a Japanese torpedo attack that was already unfolding around them. Moments later, two long lances found their targets, striking the lead American destroyer with catastrophic force. The ship erupted in a fireball, its bow lifting out of the water before snapping downward, and men were thrown across the deck as the explosion ripped through the hull. Panic spread through the American reinforcements, who immediately began evasive maneuvers, but without knowing the position of their enemy, their movements became chaotic and uncoordinated, allowing the Japanese destroyers to slip behind them and unleash rapid artillery fire that tore through exposed decks. Amid the violence, the Kuroshio continued to move like a shadow, weaving between waves, adjusting speed to stay ahead of enemy fire, and Tokemura remained composed, issuing commands with calm precision despite the thunder of distant explosions. He knew his forces had the upper hand, but he also knew this dominance could not last forever. American radar was improving, their escort tactics evolving, and their industrial might growing with terrifying speed. For now, however, the night was still Japanese territory, and the long lance remained king. But beneath the triumph, Tokemura felt a flicker of unease, one born not from fear of the Americans, but from the knowledge that Japan's victories were growing costly, that fuel reserves were thinning, that trained crews were irreplaceable, and that each battle claimed experienced sailors Japan could not afford to lose. As the burning remains of American ships drifted behind him, he wondered how long this advantage would last, and whether the Empire realized that each victory carried with it a hidden cost that no torpedo could erase. For tonight, though, the legend of the Japanese destroyers was alive and unstoppable, and the Americans once again found themselves grasping at shadows in a sea ruled by ghosts. May 8, 1942, 3:41 a.m., as the moon finally dipped beneath a thick veil of storm clouds and the ocean grew darker still, the Japanese destroyer Kuroshio raced northward to regroup with the remaining ships of its task unit, the wind carving sharp lines across the water as Captain Tokemura stood motionless on the bridge, the faint red glow reflecting in his eyes as he replayed the battle in his mind, analyzing every maneuver, every decision, every torpedo spread, for he knew that perfection was not a luxury in the Imperial Navy, it was survival, and yet, even amid victory, he sensed the silent ticking of time working against Japan, for every torpedo fired could not be replaced easily, every trained crewman lost could not be substituted. With inexperienced recruits, and every night engagement chipped away at the irreplaceable soul of the fleet. Meanwhile, dozens of miles to the south, the American survivors clung to life aboard shattered hulls, their decks slick with oil and blood, their radios crackling with frantic distress calls as engineering teams fought to keep water from flooding below decks. On the USS Chicago, half the compartments forward of midship were flooded, and the wounded filled makeshift triage areas where medics worked by flashlight, their hands trembling as they stitched wounds and stabilized men whose bodies were scorched by flame or sliced by shrapnel. The Americans, exhausted and bitter, cursed the unseen enemy that had struck them with such terrifying silence. Destroyers that moved like ghosts, torpedoes that appeared out of nowhere, and commanders who seemed to anticipate their every move. Rumors spread among the surviving crew that the Japanese had invented supernatural weapons, or that their ships were manned by demons who could see in the dark. For nothing in American doctrine explained how such devastation could happen without warning. But these were not supernatural forces. The truth lay in years of Japanese training, engineering, and doctrine, in war games that refined night attacks into a deadly science, and in the long-lance torpedo, whose unmatched range and speed gave Japan an invisible spear unlike anything the Allies possessed. As dawn approached, Tokimura ordered the Kuroshio to cut its engines to low speed and drift with the wind, a tactic meant to confuse enemy radar and avoid wake detection, while lookouts scanned the horizon for aircraft. This moment before sunrise was dangerous, for American reconnaissance planes were notorious for appearing just as the sky brightened, their silhouettes difficult to spot until it was too late. Tokimura's executive officer approached him quietly, reporting that the Oyashio had suffered minor damage from near-miss shell bursts but remained operational. The rest of the Japanese destroyers were intact, their crews exhausted yet exhilarated by the night's victory. Still, Tokimura felt no triumph, only the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that Japan was fighting a war it could not afford to prolong, and that each victory, no matter how spectacular, only delayed the inevitable reckoning. He ordered the crew to prepare for immediate evasive action, knowing American carriers might be launching aircraft even now. His instincts proved correct. Minutes later, a lookout shouted an alarm, multiple dots rising against the pale horizon, still miles away but closing fast. They were American scout planes, most likely SBD Dauntless dive bombers, searching for the Japanese task force to relay their coordinates to the fleet. Tokimura didn't hesitate. "Full speed," he barked, and the Kuroshio surged forward, engines roaring as the destroyer accelerated to over 35 knots, slicing through the water at a speed that American destroyers struggled to match. Behind them, the Oyashio and Maikaze followed suit, forming a tight evasive formation that zigzagged unpredictably to confuse enemy spotting. The American scouts dipped lower, attempting to get a clear visual of the Japanese ships, but Tokimura ordered anti-aircraft crews to hold fire. Firing now would only reveal their exact location to enemy carriers. Instead, he relied on the destroyer's speed, weaving through narrow valleys of mist rising from the sea, using nature itself as camouflage, while the American planes flew overhead, unable to distinguish the destroyers from the shifting shadows below. The Japanese escaped detection, for now. But Tokimura understood what this close encounter meant. The Americans were adapting. Their aircraft were arriving earlier each day. Their radar was improving. Their convoy escorts were learning to fight back. And soon the night itself, Japan's greatest ally, would no longer be a one-sided battlefield. Hours later, the destroyers rendezvoused with a Japanese light cruiser acting as their command ship. Officers gathered in the cramped wardroom to discuss the engagement, their conversations filled with pride yet tinged with concern. They had inflicted heavy losses, but at what cost? Japan could win battles, but America could replace ships faster than Japan could replace sailors. Still, Tokyo demanded aggressive action, and the Imperial Navy intended to deliver. Tokimura was assigned a new mission, escort a transport convoy through waters increasingly patrolled by American submarines and aircraft. It was dangerous work, less glorious than night battles, more tedious, more vulnerable, but essential to Japan's operations across the Pacific. Supplies, reinforcements, fuel, and ammunition were the lifeblood of the war, and without destroyers like the Kuroshio, Japan's far-flung island garrisons would crumble. As the sun climbed higher, casting shimmering gold across the water, Tokimura returned to his bridge, feeling the weight of the sea pressing against him like a silent judge. He wondered how many more nights Japan could dominate before the tide turned, how many more torpedo attacks would end in victory before America finally unlocked the secret to defeating the Long Lance and its ghost destroyers. For now, though, he had no time for reflection. New orders awaited, new dangers loomed, and the Kuroshio prepared to plunge once more into waters that held both triumph and tragedy. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen but approaching, the American fleet gathered strength. Ships larger, faster, and more numerous than anything Japan could sustain, bringing with them new tactics, new machines, and new resolve. The days of Japanese naval supremacy were numbered, but on this morning, as the destroyer cut through the waves with deadly grace, the legend of the Kagerō-class still lived, still struck fear, and still ruled the night. May 10, 1942, 16:22 p.m., as storm clouds gathered low over the Pacific and the horizon shifted into a rolling curtain of grey, the Japanese destroyer Kuroshio escorted a convoy of vital transport ships southward, their holds packed with ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements destined for embattled island garrisons that clung desperately to Japan's shrinking defensive perimeter. And Captain Tokimura stood at the starboard railing watching the massive swells rise like dark mountains, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath his feet as the destroyer fought the shifting currents. Gone were the triumphant rushes of night battle, replaced now by the grinding tension of convoy. Defense, a mission few celebrated but all depended upon. Beneath the waves lurked a new enemy, American submarines, whose attacks had grown more accurate, more aggressive, and more relentless with each passing month, and though the Japanese destroyers possessed powerful depth charges, their sonar equipment lagged far behind that of the Allies, forcing sailors to rely on instinct, experience, and luck. Tokimura scanned the seas constantly, as did his lookouts, aware that any ripple or shadow could signal the wake of an incoming torpedo, for the Americans had learned much since the war began, improving their Mark 14 torpedoes and coordinating wolf-pack tactics that once belonged solely to the Germans. In the engine room below, mechanics maintained the turbines with feverish care, knowing that speed was life, and a single mechanical failure at the wrong moment could doom not only the destroyer but the entire convoy. Meanwhile, radio operators listened to coded transmissions from regional commands, updating Tokimura on suspected submarine locations, though these reports were often vague and outdated, leaving him to navigate waters filled with unseen threats. Sunset approached, painting the clouds in streaks of crimson and gold that reflected across the restless sea, and while the beauty momentarily captured the attention of some younger crewmen, the veterans felt only dread. Nightfall offered no comfort when submarines hunted beneath the surface. Tokimura ordered the convoy into a zigzag pattern at dusk, a defensive maneuver intended to confuse torpedo calculations. The transport captains complied, though several ships struggled to maintain formation in the heavy seas, drifting dangerously close to one another. It was during this disordered movement that disaster struck. At 18:03 p.m., a lookout aboard the second transport screamed a warning, "Torpedo wake, port side," and before any evasive action could be taken, a massive explosion shattered the ship's midsection, sending a column of fire and debris into the sky as the hull split apart. The blast echoed across the convoy like a cannon shot, shaking the Kuroshio as Tokimura barked immediate orders. "Hard starboard! Prepare depth charges!" Sailors raced to their stations, releasing safety locks on the depth charge rails, while the hydrophone operators strained to track the submarine responsible, their ears pressed to the receivers as they tried to detect the faint mechanical rhythm of a U.S. boat diving into the deep. Panicked cries from survivors filled the air as men clung to debris, their voices barely audible over the roar of the sea. The second torpedo struck moments later, hitting another transport near the bow, flooding its forward compartments instantly and sending dozens of soldiers plunging into the water. Tokimura felt a sickening weight in his stomach. These weren't just losses of ships, but of precious supplies Japan could not replace, and the psychological impact rippled through the escort fleet. But he pushed the emotion aside. There was only one priority now: destroy the enemy submarine before it could fire again. He ordered the helmsman to circle sharply, creating a hunting pattern designed to trap the submarine beneath the convoy. The Kuroshio sonar operators reported faint contact, though it flickered in and out, distorted by depth and turbulence, and Tokimura made the split-second decision to release a full barrage. Depth charges tumbled into the water with heavy splashes, sinking seconds before erupting in thunderous blooms of foam and pressure waves that rocked the destroyer violently. The crew held on tight, waiting for signs of a kill: oil slicks, debris, air bubbles, but none appeared. The submarine had evaded them. Tokimura clenched his jaw, knowing the enemy could strike again at any moment. He radioed nearby destroyers to widen their search pattern while directing the surviving transports to regroup behind a smoke screen. The atmosphere aboard the Kuroshio grew heavier, filled with frustration and fear. The men understood that each passing hour increased the submarine's chances of repositioning for another attack. As darkness enveloped the convoy, rain began to fall in sheets, drenching the deck and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Tokimura ordered all lights extinguished and engines reduced to minimize noise. The convoy crawled forward in near silence, illuminated only by flashes of lightning that revealed the ghostly outlines of ships drifting through the storm. The men on deck whispered prayers, their nerves frayed, aware that death could come from beneath the waves at any second. It was during this tense silence that the Kuroshio sonar finally detected a stronger contact, a rhythmic pulse that indicated the submarine was directly below them, likely attempting to slip beneath the convoy for a safer firing position. Tokimura didn't hesitate. "Drop pattern 3, he commanded, and the depth charge teams released a staggered sequence designed to create overlapping underwater shock waves. The explosions detonated in rapid succession, their echoes rolling across the sea like thunder, and this time faint debris and a dark slick of oil rose to the surface, signaling a probable kill. The crew erupted into relieved cheers, the tension breaking, but only briefly. For Tokimura knew the Pacific held more than one submarine, and the Americans were coming in greater numbers, their tactics sharpening with every engagement. As the storm raged and the convoy pressed on, Tokimura returned to the bridge, soaked but unwavering, his mind already calculating the next threat, the next maneuver, the next night of survival. Japan's destroyers were still feared, still deadly, but the balance was shifting, and he felt it with every heartbeat. The ghosts of the night were beginning to meet their match. October 27, 1943, 22:41 p.m., beneath a moon slivered thin as a blade over the Solomon Sea, the Kagerō-class destroyer Kuroshio surged through black water at flank speed, its bow cutting a glowing path across the waves as Captain Tokimura prepared his ship for what had become the most dangerous mission of the war, another Tokyo Express. Night run to resupply Japanese forces trapped on Bougainville, a desperate operation that had already cost Japan dozens of destroyers and hundreds of irreplaceable sailors. Yet the Imperial Navy persisted because losing the island would crack open the entire defensive line guarding the home islands. The men aboard the Kuroshio felt the weight of this truth as they checked torpedoes, secured ammunition lockers, and tightened straps on binoculars and helmets, their faces illuminated only by the red combat lighting that gave the ship's interior the look of a steel cavern stained in blood. Radar was useless to them. Japan still lacked effective sets, so the entire mission depended on raw eyesight, intuition, and the legendary Type 93 long lance torpedoes resting in their tubes like sleeping dragons. Tokimura listened to the sea's rhythm, relying on sound and instinct the way his father had once relied on the wind while fishing in the Seto Inland Sea, and as the destroyer neared the shadowed coastline of Bougainville, he signaled the crew to silent running. Engines throttled down, lights extinguished, voices hushed to whispers, the ship becoming a ghost drifting through the night. Ahead, faint glimmers of moonlit surf broke against the silhouettes of jungle-covered mountains, while behind them lay the open sea where American destroyers, cruisers, and PT boats prowled relentlessly, waiting to intercept the express. The Kuroshio carried drums of ammunition, crates of rice, and a handful of exhausted reinforcements, men who clutched their rifles tightly, knowing they were sailing into a battlefield where even supply ships were treated like combat units. At 23:18 p.m., a lookout stiffened, squinting into the darkness. Tokimura raised his binoculars, and there, low to the water fast, he saw the unmistakable flicker of exhaust plumes from approaching enemy vessels. PT boats, he murmured, and the bridge crew tensed. American PT boats were small and fragile, but they were maddeningly fast, equipped with torpedoes that, though unreliable early in the war, had become far more lethal as the conflict progressed. The Kuroshio accelerated, its turbines screaming, the deck vibrating under the sudden surge of power as sailors rushed to their stations. Tracer rounds streaked across the waves like fiery insects as the PT boats opened fire with their .50 caliber machine guns, their engines buzzing like angry hornets in the night. Tokimura's voice cut through the chaos. "Prepare starboard battery. Return fire when ready." The destroyer's 25mm guns roared to life, spraying arcs of fire into the darkness. The night exploded in flashes of red, orange, and white as bullets hammered the air, splashed against the sea, and ricocheted off steel. One PT boat veered sharply to avoid a burst of fire, but another pressed in closer, launching a torpedo that streaked beneath the surface like a pale ghost barely visible in moonlight. "Hard port!" Tokimura shouted, and the Kuroshio leaned violently, throwing several sailors off balance as the torpedo passed just astern, missing by mere meters. The PT boat's wake shimmered silver as it zipped past, but not before a well-aimed burst from the Kuroshio's forward guns tore into its side, sending it spinning into a plume of water and flame. Yet there was no time to celebrate. Bigger threats lurked beyond the PT boats. Minutes later, the sharp-eyed lookout spotted 3 silhouettes on the horizon, long and angular, with tall masts. American destroyers. Tokimura's stomach tightened. These were Burke's boys, the U.S. Navy's famed nighttime hunters, equipped with superior radar, better guns, faster firing control systems, and crews drilled to perfection. Under normal circumstances, the Kuroshio would avoid such ships entirely, but tonight, the cargo had to reach the shore or thousands of Japanese troops would starve. Tokimura had no choice. The Americans opened the engagement first. Dazzling blue-white flashes erupted from their guns, and seconds later, the Kuroshio shook violently as shells crashed into the water around her, geysers of spray rising higher than the deck. Tokimura ordered smoke. Thick, black clouds billowed from the stern, cloaking the Kuroshio as she weaved through incoming fire. "Prepare long lance torpedoes." His men scrambled to remove the safeties and adjust firing angles, the torpedo crews moving with the discipline of ritual dancers performing an ancient war ceremony. The long lance torpedo was Japan's one enduring advantage, a weapon so advanced that the Allies still underestimated its range and power, and tonight, the Kuroshio would wield it like a final desperate sword. At 23:52 p.m., Tokimura saw his moment. The U.S. destroyers, confident in their radar-guided pursuit, had closed too quickly, unaware that they were now within killing distance of the Type 93s. "Fire!" he commanded, and 5 torpedoes leapt into the sea, their compressed oxygen engines leaving no telltale bubble trail, rendering them invisible. The Kuroshio veered away instantly, retreating into her own smoke, engines straining, crew praying. The American destroyers continued firing, unaware that death raced toward them beneath the waves. Then, impact. A thunderous explosion ripped through the night as one of the U.S. destroyers was struck near its magazine, the blast so immense it briefly turned night to day. Flames shot skyward, debris raining into the sea, and cries of shock echoed across radio frequencies. The second American destroyer swerved violently to avoid the remaining torpedoes, colliding with one of the PT boats instead, throwing both vessels into chaos. Tokimura seized the advantage and ordered the Kuroshio toward the shoreline, reaching the predetermined drop point. Sailors heaved supply drums and crates into the surf, while the reinforcements leapt overboard, swimming toward the shadows of friendly troops waiting on the beach. The entire offloading took only minutes. Every second counted, but just as the final crate splashed into the water, an emergency call came from engineering. Hit to the aft section. Fuel leak. A stray American shell had pierced the hull earlier, and seawater now flooded compartments dangerously close to the boilers. Tokimura refused to abandon ship. He ordered emergency teams to seal the breach while preparing for a fighting withdrawal. The Kuroshio turned back into open water, engines roaring unevenly, smoke trailing behind her like a wounded dragon's breath. The surviving American destroyer, enraged by the loss of its sister ship, pursued with relentless determination. Shells rained down around the Kuroshio, each explosion shaking the deck, but Tokimura held firm, shouting corrections, steering evasive zigzags, and timing engine bursts to throw off American targeting. For 40 agonizing minutes, the chase continued, until the Kuroshio finally slipped into a thick bank of fog, a miracle delivered by the sea itself. Tokimura ordered complete silence, engines barely above idle, as the fog swallowed the destroyer whole. The American ship fired blindly, searchlights slicing through the mist, but the Kuroshio was already gone, drifting like a ghost through the grey void until the last echoes of pursuit faded into the night. Only when dawn broke did Tokimura allow himself to breathe freely again. The Kuroshio, battered but alive, glided through calm morning seas, her crew exhausted yet triumphant, knowing they had survived one of the most perilous missions of the war. But Tokimura also understood a darker truth. Each victory cost more than Japan could afford, and each mission carved deeper into the strength of a navy running out of ships, fuel, and time. The Kuroshio had escaped, but the war was closing in. December 3, 1944, 4:55 a.m., under a sky drowned in monsoon clouds rolling like wounded giants over the South China Sea, the destroyer Kuroshio limped through churning grey swells as Captain Tokimura gripped the bridge rail with white knuckles, feeling every shudder of the ship beneath him, every metallic groan of a hull that had survived too many engagements, too many night battles, too many close calls against an enemy growing stronger with each passing tide. And although dawn remained a faint whisper on the horizon, the faint orange glow of distant explosions flickered intermittently across the sky, evidence of yet another American air raid battering. Japanese-held islands further north, a grim reminder that the balance of the Pacific had shifted irreversibly, and that Japan's once mighty navy was now fighting not for victory but for survival. The Kuroshio had returned to Rabaul for temporary repairs, but the dockyard crews, starving, overworked, and lacking materials, could offer only crude patches, leaving the destroyer wounded, slower, and increasingly vulnerable. Yet Tokimura pushed his ship back to sea because Japan's situation had become too desperate to allow rest. The Tokyo Express had become a death sentence, but it still sailed because the Imperial Army demanded supplies, reinforcements, and evacuation runs that could only be delivered by destroyers like the Kuroshio, ships that had once carried themselves like predators but were now hunted relentlessly across waters they no longer controlled. The Americans had radar, air superiority, fast carriers, submarines that lurked along every route, and destroyers armed with new tactics crafted by commanders like Burke and Arley, whose philosophies emphasized aggressive night attacks, strategies the Japanese had once mastered but could no longer withstand. Tokimura saw the change everywhere. In the skies, where American Hellcats roamed like hawks, in the seas, where submarines fired torpedoes with unnerving precision, and in the morale of his men, who still obeyed orders but carried a weariness in their eyes, a silent understanding that their empire was shrinking, collapsing under the weight of a war it had gambled everything to win. As the destroyer pressed northward toward the Philippines, a radio message crackled through the static, urgent, barely readable, but unmistakable. Enemy landing forces approaching Ormoc Bay. All available ships to intercept. Immediate action required. Tokimura closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling slowly, because he understood instantly what this meant. Japan was committing its remaining destroyers, its last naval strength, to a suicidal effort to halt the American invasion of Leyte, a battle so desperate that even battered ships like the Kuroshio were thrown into the fray. The Americans had to be stopped at Ormoc Bay, or the Philippines would fall entirely. severing Japan's access to vital oil fields and crushing the Empire's final hope of resisting the Allied advance. And so, even though the Kuroshio's engines rattled, even though her ammunition was low and her hull fractured like an aging warrior's bones, Tokimura set his course toward the smoke-choked waters of Leyte Gulf, where the U.S. 7th Fleet moved with terrifying coordination, launching waves of PT boats, cruisers, escort carriers, and destroyers to choke off every Japanese attempt to reinforce the garrison on Leyte. As the Kuroshio neared Ormoc Bay under the cloaked blackness of pre-dawn darkness, Tokimura scanned the horizon and saw the silhouettes of other Japanese destroyers, Yukike's, Asashimo, and the battered remnants of the 2nd Destroyer Squadron, all converging like ghosts for what would likely be their final stand. The radio quiet was suffocating. Every captain knew the stakes, knew the odds, and knew that few, if any, would return home. Suddenly, at 5:21 a.m., the sea erupted with white streaks of American rocket fire as PT boats swarmed forward, their engines snarling, their wakes glowing under the muzzle flashes of rapid-fire .50 caliber guns. Tracer rounds sliced through the darkness as Japanese flares burst overhead, casting the raging water in eerie green and white illumination. The Kuroshio's gunners opened fire instantly, cutting down 2 PT boats that ventured too close, their shattered hulls exploding into flame as sailors flung themselves into burning waves, but more boats pressed in, firing torpedoes that streaked through the water with lethal intent. Tokimura's instincts saved the Kuroshio twice. Sharp turns, well-timed throttle bursts, but the third torpedo came too close and detonated under the stern of the destroyer Asashimo, sending her into a spiraling death roll that left the sea glowing orange with fire and drifting oil. The loss was devastating, but the battle had only begun. Beyond the PT boats lurked the true threat. American destroyers steaming south at high speed, responding to the firefight with radar-guided precision. Their guns opened first. Bright flashes, thunderous booms, and within seconds, the Japanese formation staggered under the barrage as shells slashed through masts, tore open decks, and shattered gun mounts. Tokimura ordered smoke, maneuvering through the chaos as the Kuroshio's long lance torpedoes were prepared for launch, but even as his crew raced to ready the tubes, the sky suddenly roared with a sound that froze every heart aboard. Aircraft. From behind the distant hills came swarms of American bombers and attack planes, Douglas A-20s, B-25 Mitchells, and rocket-firing P-38 Lightnings, sent to finish what the ships had begun. The air raid struck like a hammer. Rockets slammed into the water around the Japanese destroyers, geysers erupting alongside bursting flak. Incendiaries splashed onto decks, igniting fuel drums meant for the garrison. Machine gun fire strafed across exposed crew, cutting down gunners at their stations. Tokimura yelled for evasive action, and the Kuroshio lurched violently as bombs fell around her, one striking close enough to rip open the hull plates on her starboard side with a deafening metallic shriek. The destroyer buckled, listing sharply, alarms blaring, compartments flooding. Through smoke and chaos, Tokimura saw the Yukike's launch a volley of long lance torpedoes before vanishing into the haze of fire and spray, but the Kuroshio no longer had the stability to fire accurately. Still, Tokimura refused defeat. He ordered one last attempt, one final gesture of defiance from a ship that had survived years of impossible odds. With flames licking the aft deck and water rushing into shattered compartments, the crew managed to ready 2 torpedoes. Just 2, but they fired them with the same precision that had made Japan's destroyers legendary. Moments later, far across the bay, a distant explosion signaled that at least one torpedo had found its mark, striking an American transport ship unloading troops at the shoreline, sending debris into the sky like confetti of iron and flame. It was a symbolic victory, but fleeting. The next wave of bombers descended, releasing a cluster of bombs that fell toward the Kuroshio like falling stars. Tokimura stood tall on the bridge, refusing to abandon his post, gripping the railing as the world around him erupted in white light. The bombs hit the forward deck, punching through steel, igniting ammunition stores, sending a plume of fire higher than the mast. The shock wave tore through the ship, ripping open bulkheads and killing dozens in an instant. Water surged through the gaping wounds, the bow dipped, the engines died. The Kuroshio's death had begun. Tokimura ordered abandoned ship, but many sailors refused to leave until they carried the wounded to safety. Lifeboats splashed into the burning sea as the destroyer groaned one final time, her stern rising as the bow plunged beneath the waves. Flames hissed and sputtered as seawater claimed the bridge, the torpedo tubes, the shattered guns, all the once proud features of a destroyer that had defied the U.S. Navy longer than almost any of her class. At 6:12 a.m., the Kuroshio vanished beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark water of Ormoc Bay, leaving only smoke, drifting wreckage, and the faint cries of survivors clinging to debris as American aircraft circled overhead. Takemura himself survived, clinging to a piece of shattered decking, watching the sun rise over a battlefield littered with sinking ships and surviving sailors, Japanese and American alike, drifting in the vast indifferent sea. He knew then that Japan's naval spirit, the fierce confidence that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to Java Sea, from the Aleutians to Guadalcanal, had finally broken. Not because Japan lacked courage or discipline, but because the industrial might, technological evolution, and relentless pressure of the United States had overwhelmed an empire built on traditions that could not withstand a modern war's demands. In the months to come, Japan would lose the Philippines, then Okinawa, then the war itself. The long Lance torpedo would never again roar through Pacific waters in battle. The Kagerō-class destroyers would fade into history, their legends living on in the stories told by survivors who remembered their speed, their daring, their ability to slip through darkness like steel phantoms. But the legacy of the Kuroshio and her sisters would endure, not as symbols of defeat, but as testaments to sailors who fought with unmatched skill and bravery against impossible odds, sailors who turned night battles into moments of terrifying beauty, sailors whose courage made even their enemies whisper with respect. And long after the Pacific War ended, American officers would still speak of the Japanese destroyers with awe, recounting how those ships, armed with the deadliest torpedo ever built, had prowled the night like ghosts, striking fiercely before vanishing into darkness. In the end, the sea claimed them, as it claims all warriors, but legends do not sink. They rise, carried forward by history, memory, and the shared respect of men who know what it means to fight in the unforgiving vastness of the ocean. Thus the story of the Kuroshio, and of Japan's unstoppable, uncatchable destroyers, lives on as one of the Pacific's most haunting and electrifying chapters, a reminder that even in losing, some warriors achieve immortality. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.